Have you ever had someone deliberately impose unreasonable rules on you? Have you ever received a threatening letter from an organization claiming that you must obey their orders, even though you know for sure that you have done nothing wrong? Have you ever felt powerless against those in power just because they have the right to give orders? How many times have we given up because we think we can't change anything? Have you ever known your rights? This story is not about offense, but about legal rights, fighting back against manipulation, and protecting yourself from power plays that are disguised as rules. If you have ever been in a similar situation, listen up, because it may help you not become the next victim. But don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on these crazy HOA stories. I never thought moving to a new neighborhood would be a nightmare. I thought moving to Green Meadows would bring a peaceful life, sipping coffee on the porch every morning, looking out at the lush garden where Max could run free. The corner house had a large yard, enough room for a vegetable garden, flower beds, even a grapevine to shade the summer. The air was fresh, the neighbors were friendly, everything seemed perfect. The move went smoothly. The moving crew packed quickly on the first day. Max watched carefully and quickly adapted, running around the yard excitedly. Looking at him, I smiled. Perhaps this was the beginning of a new, peaceful chapter. The first morning at Green Meadows, I woke up early, not because of the noise of the city, but because of the unusual quiet. The sound of birds chirping outside the window made me realize that I had not heard this sound for a long time. I poured coffee, stepped out onto the porch, looked at the diverse gardens of the neighbors, and imagined my own small vegetable garden. That same day, I set about building a low wooden fence around the yard to give Max some space to be safe. Since I don't like chains, a small fence was the perfect choice to keep him out of the street while still having some space to roam. I measured, drilled, and staked myself, a simple job but very satisfying when it was done. As the sun was setting, I sat on the steps and watched Max play on the grass. He was chasing a dry leaf, rolling around like it was the happiest day of his life. I took a sip of water, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. In my mind, I was already planning for the next few days, buying another set of outdoor furniture, maybe finding some rare seeds to plant in the garden. Everything was going exactly as I had hoped, and I couldn't wait to enjoy this new life for a while longer. Little did I know, however, that just as I was beginning to settle in, a storm was brewing. And it was not of natural origin. As the sun began to set behind the rooftops, I noticed a figure appear on the sidewalk ahead. She stood there for a long time, arms crossed over her chest, examining the fence I had erected as if appraising a work of art, but with a critical eye. She was stocky, with neatly curled blonde hair, and wore a stiff-looking beige blazer, and she exuded the authority of someone more accustomed to giving orders than listening. I didn't have to ask to know who she was. In the Green Meadows neighborhood records, I had seen a name that appeared repeatedly on the notices and bylaws. Karen Mitchell, president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. If HOAs were the policing arm of a neighborhood, Karen was the one who wielded absolute power. I'd heard stories of oppressive HOAs, but I didn't expect to encounter a typical version of one on my first day. She walked up to the fence, clearing her throat deliberately as if expecting me to initiate conversation. But I didn't. I sat there, holding my water bottle, looking straight ahead but feeling her eyes on me. Finally, unable to wait any longer, she spoke up. "I see you've put up a fence." Her voice trailed off, a mixture of observation and criticism, as if I'd just placed a grotesque statue in the town square. I didn't seem too concerned, just nodded nonchalantly. "I don't remember you applying for permission to put up this fence." That made me raise an eyebrow. I had read the HOA rules before I bought the house. There was no provision requiring a homeowner to get permission to build a low fence like this. If I was breaking the law, she would have clearly cited the rules. Instead, she just stood there, waiting for me to get flustered and back out. I looked at my simple wooden fence, then turned to her. "I don't see anything about that in the..." Discomfort flashed across Karen's face. She seemed unaccustomed to being challenged, even with a simple question. She blinked for a second before replying, "Those documents aren't always up to date. The HOA has the right to decide what's appropriate for the neighborhood's aesthetic." I realized right away that this was not about rules, but about power. Karen didn't care about terms. She wanted to force others to do what she wanted. I took a breath, trying to calm myself. She continued, her voice warning sweet. "We care about the unity of the neighborhood. If everyone builds fences and plants whatever they want, the neighborhood will lose its overall beauty." I looked around. Other houses had front yards decorated in all sorts of ways. Some had porches, some had statues, some had bicycles parked on the porch, and no one complained. I didn't see any unity to protect in her words, other than the HOA wanting to control everything. I didn't argue. I just nodded politely and stood up, walking into the house, leaving Karen standing there with a disapproving look on her face. I knew this wasn't the end. She wasn't the type to give up easily, and I wasn't the type to be bullied. I just didn't expect it to be the beginning. I thought my encounter with Karen would be a fleeting moment of discomfort, that if I didn't give in, she would understand that she couldn't manipulate me as easily as the other residents of this neighborhood. But I was wrong. A week after our first meeting, I received a letter from the HOA neatly tucked into my front door mailbox. It was printed on heavy paper with the HOA logo prominently displayed in the top corner, as if the formality of the letter could mask the absurdity of the letter. I opened it and read the threatening bureaucratic text. The HOA stated that the fence I had erected was on community property and that I was required by law to remove it immediately. If I did not comply within 7 days, I would be fined a substantial amount of money each day until the fence was gone. The more I read, the angrier and more amused I became. I had checked the property documents very carefully before buying the house. I knew every boundary line on the map, every clause in the contract. The front yard belonged to me, not the HOA, and they had no right to demand that I return it. And now they were blatantly declaring it community property, all because a simple fence made Karen uncomfortable. I was no stranger to these kinds of tricks. This wasn't a rule, this was a power play. I folded the letter, put it on the table, and looked out the window at the front yard. The fence was still there, as straight and sturdy as the day I first put it up. Max was sprawled on the grass, his tail wagging slightly when he saw me looking out. The dog knew nothing about legal battles, imposed regulations, or manipulation games. I didn't respond right away. I didn't call or email them because I knew they wouldn't give me a straight answer. Instead, I took my time and did what they didn't expect, which was to start gathering evidence. I found the original zoning plan for the property, checked the boundaries on the city's resource system, and made sure I had everything I needed to protect my rights. I took my time, because I knew that if they sent the first letter, they wouldn't stop there. And just as I expected, 3 days later, another letter arrived. It was still a fancy piece of paper with threatening language, but this time the tone was firmer, as if they were losing patience. They emphasized that if I didn't remove the fence, they would take enforcement action, even sue me. I chuckled. Did they really think they could scare me with a lawsuit? I didn't respond in a hurry. I left the letter on the table, took a sip of coffee, and looked out the window. The storm I'd been feeling since day one had finally arrived. But I wasn't one to be afraid of storms. I was one to face them head on, And this time, I wasn't going to back down. If the HOA thought they could force me to give in with threatening letters, they had misjudged their opponent. I knew the only way to end this farce was to present irrefutable evidence, a legally documented fact that even the HOA couldn't twist to their liking. I needed to get the property lines officially verified, and for that, I knew exactly where to go. The next morning, I looked up the information on the city's website, knowing that the land records at the Natural Resources Department showed clear, legally protected property lines that were beyond the HOA's jurisdiction. After determining the process, I drafted a formal request, attaching the property information and supporting documentation. I didn't rush or let anger get the better of me, because this wasn't just a confrontation with the HOA, it was a matter of principle. If I gave in, I would open the door for them to impose the same thing on everyone else in the neighborhood. All day long, I went through my documents, checking the home purchase contract to make sure there were no clauses the HOA could exploit. I compared the zoning plan to the city's maps, carefully cross-checking the data. But when I looked up the public data, I found that the HOA had repeatedly tried to claim ownership of land outside its jurisdiction. This confirmed my suspicions. This wasn't a mistake, but a deliberate strategy. I knew the verification process would take a few days, but I didn't sit around waiting. Instead, I did some research on the HOA. If they were going to play power games with me, I needed to understand how they operated. I studied the bylaws to see how much power they really had and how they had overstepped their authority. At the same time, I looked at my neighbors to see how many had unreasonable HOA rules imposed on them, how many had reluctantly complied just to avoid trouble. That evening, I sat at my desk, looking over the documents I had gathered. I felt a strange calm, a sense of certainty that I was on the right track. I had no doubt. The HOA had no right to my land, and they were trying to exploit the residents' lack of legal knowledge to extend their control. Little did they know, they had encountered someone who would not be easily manipulated this time. I took a sip of coffee and looked out into the front yard where the fence still stood resolutely. There was no need to rush into a response because I knew the facts were on my side. I just needed to wait for the official documents from the Land Resources Department, and when I had them in hand, I would show the HOA that they couldn't just redraw the boundaries on a whim. The storm might be continuing, but this time I was in the driver's seat. I am not easily impatient, but waiting for something that would prove me right, each passing hour was a test. In the days that followed after submitting the land verification request, I continued my daily life but kept an eye on the HOA. There was no further letter or appearance from Karen. Their silence did not reassure me. On the contrary, it confirmed that they were waiting for my response or preparing for the next move. Then one morning, as I opened my mailbox, I saw an envelope from the city's Land Resources Department. I picked it up, feeling a slight rush of adrenaline. I didn't open it right away. I walked into the house, sat down at my desk, carefully cut open the envelope, pulled out the document, and scanned the printed text. It took less than a minute for me to confirm what I had known all along. The HOA was completely wrong. The file contained survey maps, ownership records, and legal documents, all of which asserted that the front yard where I had built the fence belonged to me, not to the public. The HOA had no legal basis to control it. The city-approved boundary map from the planning stage remained intact and had never belonged to the HOA or had any changes in ownership history. That made their request not only baseless but also potentially malicious harassment. I leaned back in my chair and skimmed through the documents again, more slowly this time, savoring the feeling of absolute certainty. Not surprise, because I had never doubted the outcome. It was a quiet satisfaction, the feeling you get when you know you've been on the right track all along, that you haven't been drawn into someone else's game, and most importantly, that you have irrefutable evidence in your hands. I set the documents down on the table and looked out the window at the front yard. The fence was still there, steadfast as a silent declaration that I would not be easily subdued. Max was sprawled on the grass, oblivious to the legal battle being waged to protect this small space. I took a sip of coffee, allowing myself to savor the moment of victory before moving on to the next step. I didn't need to rush. The HOA had played mind games, sent threatening letters, tried to force me to give in without providing any evidence, but now I had the strongest weapon: the truth. And I would use it when the time came. I knew full well that they didn't expect anything other than submission from me. But I wasn't here to please them. I was here to get justice. Not just for myself, but for everyone in this neighborhood who had ever been bullied by the HOA with unreasonable regulations and baseless scare tactics. I took one last look at the file, carefully folding it. I was ready for the next step. The HOA thought they could manipulate me with their fake power, but now I had something stronger, the law, on my side, and I wasn't afraid to use it. I didn't react quickly. With the undeniable evidence in hand, I knew I had the upper hand. The HOA had tried to force me to give in with threatening letters and forced fence removals without any legal basis, but now I was the one setting the rules. They thought I would be easily swayed by a neighborhood management organization, but their biggest mistake was forgetting that I was not a pushover. I spent the morning preparing my counterattack. First, I gathered all the documents I had: the purchase contract, the official land boundary map from the city's resource department, and the history of correspondence the HOA had sent me. Each document was carefully scanned and arranged in an order that could not be denied. I left no room for error in my argument. If the HOA decided to continue down this path of confrontation, they would have to face the legal truth, not just vague threat. After I had everything in place, I wrote an email to the HOA, addressed to Karen Mitchell. I didn't use any strong or threatening language. Instead, I kept my tone professional, citing legal documents that stated the land belonged to me and that the HOA had no right to interfere. I pointed out the flaws in their argument, asserting that the request to remove the fence was invalid. At the same time, I warned them that sending threatening letters and making unfounded claims of ownership could be considered harassment, and that I was prepared to take the matter to court if necessary. After double-checking my words, I hit send. The email was delivered, sending a clear message that I was not someone who could be intimidated by bureaucratic tricks. I knew they wouldn't ignore it. This was no longer an emotional argument, but a real legal issue where the law was on my side. I closed my computer, stepped out onto the porch to get some fresh air, but could feel the invisible tension that had settled over the neighborhood. I knew the HOA and Karen wouldn't let it go easily, but this time they had no choice but to accept reality. I went about my day as usual, but kept an eye on my inbox. Late in the afternoon, the HOA responded. No threats or warnings of enforcement, just a brief, reluctant email. "We have received your documents and will review this matter." I chuckled. This was their way of admitting defeat without saying it. They knew they couldn't win, but still tried to maintain the facade of power. I looked out into the yard. The fence was still strong. Max was happily running around, carefree in his space. But he didn't know that his presence was the reason I was willing to go all the way in this fight. The HOA was used to bullying the residents, but this time they had encountered an opponent beyond their control, and I had no intention of stopping here. 2 days after my email, the HOA's response changed. There were no more warning letters or phone calls to remove the fence. Karen, who had always been a force to be reckoned with, was nowhere to be seen. She used to roam the neighborhood as an undercover vigilante, but she was nowhere to be seen. This silence was not an overt concession, but a quiet retreat to maintain her facade of power. I knew she had read my email, seen the legal documents, and understood that there was no way out but to give up. If she tried to push things further, I was prepared to take her to court, which the HOA did not want. A lawsuit would not only be a waste of time and money, but would expose their abuse of power, and the last thing they wanted was to lose the fear they had worked so hard to build in the community. On the third day after my email, I received a response from Karen. It was not as lengthy as the warning letters. It was a short email, and it had a different tone, polite, even condescending. We have reviewed your situation and have determined that removing the fence is unnecessary. Thank you for the details. I read the words over, smiling at the ambiguity of her writing. She did not admit that she was wrong. She did not apologize for harassing me with her ridiculous letters. But this silent retreat was the clearest evidence of her failure. She had no choice but to pretend that this was a misunderstanding, and hope that I would not bring it up again. I didn't respond right away. I wanted Karen to feel my silence, the way she'd tried to impose her silence on me. I wanted her to understand that I knew what she was doing, that I knew this wasn't an act of kindness, but an attempt to save face. But I also knew that I didn't have to do anything more. I had won, and she knew it. I walked out into the front yard, looking at the fence that still stood as a symbol of my indomitability. Max came running up, wagging his tail as if sensing that everything was okay. I patted his head, feeling truly at peace for the first time since moving in. Karen could continue to rule the HOA, impose unreasonable rules, but she wouldn't dare try again with me. She knew who I was and knew that I wasn't to be bullied. The silence from the HOA in the days that followed was a final confirmation of my victory. No more threatening letters, no more unreasonable demands, and most importantly, no more Karen appearing at my door with her critical eyes and imposing tone. My fence still stood there intact as a testament to the legal ownership that I had successfully defended. I moved on with my life, but I couldn't deny that after this incident, I saw my neighborhood in a different light. What seemed like a peaceful place was governed not by the law, but by the fear the HOA imposed on its residents. Those who lacked knowledge or determination were easily forced to follow unreasonable rules to avoid trouble. I don't know how many people had previously succumbed to Karen's manipulations, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't dare do that to me again. I noticed a change in my neighbors. More people greeted me. Their eyes were respectful instead of distant. Without asking, I knew they had witnessed the confrontation between me and the HOA. They saw me resisting instead of submitting, and perhaps my victory gave them some hope that the HOA was not an untouchable force, that they had the right to speak up when they knew they were right. I am not a person who likes to fight, but I believe in fairness. I did not move here to be a rebel, but I am not the type to turn a blind eye to injustice. My fence is still there, not just a physical boundary, but a symbol of a more important principle, that no one can blatantly deprive me of my rights just because they have a little power in their hands. As time went on, the HOA continued to exist, still issuing general notices about neighborhood rules, but I was no longer their target. They knew that if they tried again, they would face resistance they couldn't control. Karen remained as HOA president, but she never sent me any requests since. Maybe she had learned that not everyone was so easily subdued, that there were people willing to fight to the death to protect their rights. I stood on my porch one morning, coffee in hand, looking out at the front yard I had successfully defended. Max was lazing on the grass, enjoying the early morning sun, oblivious to what had happened. To him, everything was the same, but to me, I knew I had affirmed something important. that true peace does not come from avoiding trouble, but from knowing that if someone tried to encroach on my rights, I had the courage to stand up and fight them back. So if you find yourself in a similar situation where you are being forced by unreasonable regulations, being intentionally overruled by someone, or being threatened with baseless administrative tricks, remember that you have the right to ask questions. You have the right to demand evidence, and most importantly, you have the right to fight for what is yours. Don't let anyone decide your fate just because they think you won't fight back. Be the person they can't bully. But don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on the next crazy HOA stories.